Wow, you guys are good. So thank you for everyone for being here. My name is Reggie Jean. I'm the member of the BU Wheelock Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee and Director for Upward Bound Math Science, which is held within the Office of College Access and Student Success at BU Wheelock. Welcome to Can We Talk About Race? A conversation with Dr. Beverly Tatum. Before we begin, I would like to thank the founding departments for making this event possible. BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development and Dean Chard, BU Wheelock EDI Committee, BU Wheelock Marcom, CGS, COM, Questrom, CFA, the Office of Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, the Howard Thurman Center and Offices of the President, Provost, and SVP for External Affairs for helping spread the word, and finally the BU Bookstore. So they're here selling Dr. Tatum's book for those who are interested in purchasing. Finally, I want to thank all the BU Wheelock staff and faculty that volunteers as ushers and at check-in. Please give them a round of applause. So our aim today is to delve into a conversation about race. We will hear from Dr. Tatum and take questions from our moderator and from you. We will request that you use a couple of podium microphones. If you do have questions, and you'll have a chance to step up at the right time to ask a question. Remember to identify who you are. After the talk, Dr. Tatum has agreed to do a brief book signing before she heads to another event on campus. As part of introductions, let's get a sense of who is in the room. So and we're going to start with you. By raise a hand, and you can raise your hand multiple times. Who is faculty here? Raise your hand if you're faculty. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you're staff. Staff, okay, represent. And then raise your hand, students. Any students? Okay, I think the students win. And then if you're alumni of the university. Okay, all right, I didn't forget. Alumni. And then lastly, if you're from outside of BU and a guest here, raise your hands. Wow, so we have a great split in the audience. Everybody, welcome for being here. Thank you for being here. Now that we have a sense of who you are, I have the distinct honor of letting you know a little bit more about Dr. Tatum. Beverly Christine Daniel Tatum was born on September 27, 1954, in Tallahassee, Florida. So happy belated birthday to you. She was born 4 months after the 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Board of Education that outlawed race-based segregation in schools. Dr. Tatum grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, so she's from Massachusetts, right? Welcome back. Dr. Tatum earned a BA in psychology from Wesleyan University. She also received her MA in clinical psychology and a PhD in clinical psychology, both from the University of Michigan. She also earned a master's in religious studies at Hartford Seminary. Over the course of her career, she served as a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westfield State, and Mount Holyoke College. And I know some students from Mount Holyoke who are here too, some alumni. These colleges were where Dr. Tatum taught courses like psychology of racism. There, she observed many students go through stages of racial identity development. In 1992, Dr. Beverly Tatum widely cited article talking about race, learning about racism, the application of racial identity development theory in the classroom was published in the Harvard Educational Review, bless you. She describes her experiences teaching classes on race-related issues in the article. She said, "I was convinced that helping students understand the ways in which racism operates in their own lives and what they could do about it was a social responsibility that I should accept." In 1997, Dr. Tatum wrote the widely acclaimed book, "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" and Other Conversations About Race. The book was a national bestseller. and was selected as the Multicultural Book of the Year in 1998 by the National Association of Multicultural Education. New York had the book as required reading for all private school faculty and staff. Dr. Tatum then served as Dean and Acting President at Mount Holyoke College, and then from 2002 to 2015, Dr. Tatum served as President of Spelman College, and her years there were marked by innovation, growth, and visionary leadership. Any Spelman alum in the house? Oh, a couple of hands right back there, all right. In 2014, the American Psychological Association presented Dr. Tatum with the award for Outstanding Lifetime Contribution to Psychology, the highest honor presented by the APA, sort of like, I guess, the Hall of Fame for psychology, maybe. In 2017, Dr. Tatum gave a widely popular TED Talk that features my all-time favorite TED Talk title, Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? In that same year, she authored the 20th anniversary edition, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, which serves as the basis of our conversation today. Dr. Tatum is married to Dr. Travis Tatum, and they are parents of 2 adult sons. Let's give a warm Boston University welcome to Dr. Beverly Tatum as she comes upon the stage with Michelle Porche and Dr. Raul Fernandez. I will now pass it off to Dr. Fernandez, who serves as Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and is a lecturer at BU Wheelock. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Reggie, and good morning, everyone. Thank you. I will not stand too long, at least in the way of this amazing conversation between Drs. Porche and Tatum. What I will say is good morning, and I do want to say that before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Massachusetts and Mashpee Wampanoag tribes on which we are meeting today. I do ask you to reflect on the role that education has played in the genocide of those people on this land and throughout this nation, as well as the impact of slavery, segregation, and other forms of oppression. I'm also here to bring you greetings on behalf of our Dean, David Chard, as well as our community of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. I've actually been all 4 of those at one point or another. For many of you, this may be your first time engaging with our recently merged college, which brought 2 historic institutions together, BU School of Education and Wheelock College. And while both institutions have engaged meaningfully in the greater Boston community for more than a century, and we continue to do so, it's also our commitment to engage meaningfully with this community, the Boston University community. Today's event, featuring the living legend that is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, is one example of that. I will say Dr. Tatum's visit is brought to us by BU Wheelock's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, which does build upon the legacy of many who came before us, including faculty, staff, and students, past and present, who have worked to ensure that our college implements policies and practices which lead to just outcomes, which is still an ongoing project for us, to be sure. I do want to take a moment to recognize one of those former members, Reggie Jean, who you just heard from. He's a man that I've known for more than 2 decades, and while many folks were involved in putting this event together, he is the person most responsible for Dr. Tatum's visit. So just some appreciation for Mr. Jean. With that said, I will say thank you, and I will leave it to Dr. Michelle Porche, who, by the way, another word about a colleague of mine, is a phenomenal teacher, a phenomenal researcher. But when I think of Dr. Porche, I think about her service to this community, in particular into mentoring students, mentoring graduate students in particular. Dr. Porche is well deserving of being on this stage with Dr. Tatum, and I'll let you 2 take it away. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for being here today. I just wanted to start by saying, for those who are unfamiliar with your book, what are some key points that you really want people to take away?
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Reggie Jean for that illustrated introduction. That was really nice, so thank you. And I'm looking forward very much to this conversation. So as we saw in the introduction, I wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race originally in 1997. And at that time, I was a faculty member at Mount Holyoke College, teaching a course on the psychology of racism. And my book really grew out of that teaching experience. I wanted to, the book has 3 parts, and it was modeled after my course, which had 3 parts. And the 3 parts are described this way: what, so what, and now what. And what I mean by that is what? What is racism? How do we understand that concept? What's the difference between racism as a systemic phenomenon, a system of advantage based on race, as compared to just racial prejudice? Those are different things, but people often use those terms interchangeably. So I wanted to clarify what we were talking about. And then the so what does it mean to us as individuals growing up in a racist society? What does that mean in terms of how we think about ourselves and other people? That's the racial identity piece of it. And then now what? If what we see is a problem, what can we do about it? And the end of the book is focused on taking action. So fast forward 20 years, the 2017 version is organized in the same way and covers the same content, except through the lens of what's happened in the last 20 years. So I find that often I meet people who read the first book and wonder, well, what's different about the second, this 2017 version? And I like to say, really, the 2017 version reflects changes in what I call the 4 Ps. So what are those 4 Ps? Population, politics, polarization, and psychology. And I'm happy to say a little bit more about that if you'd like.
Oh, yes.
So P, population. So Reggie outed me as somebody who just collected my Medicare card. Born in 1954, right? And in 1954, the US population was 90% white, European American, 10% everybody else. And if you think about the population today, it's quite striking how different today's population is, even from 20 years ago. So today, if you were born in the year 2000, or let's say 1997, if you were born in 1997, you're 21 or almost 22 now, and your cohort of, the young people who are in that age group are more like 52% white and 48% everybody else. That's a big change. If we look at the total US population, including all generations, the white population now is a little over 66%, about 2/3 white, and 1/3 people of color. So if we think about just the demographic shifts, that has implications for our politics as we see today, right, in terms of the political issues. Politics, both in terms of, let's say, the election of President Barack Obama, would not have been possible without the greater voting participation of this growing population of color. Yes, there were many white people who voted for him, but it was really a coalition of those white people and a lot of people of color that made his election possible. Fast forward to the election of our current president, Donald Trump, and what we see is that some of, certainly perhaps not all, but a lot of his support is perhaps a pushback against some of those demographic changes and concerns fueled by those demographic changes. So we see the connection between population and politics. I'm happy to talk more about this, but I'll just say a little bit now. But each of, if we think about 20 years since 1997 and 2017, it's not just that the population has changed and that there's a response to that population change, But each of the 4 presidents we've had during that time period, Bill Clinton in 1997, followed by George W. Bush, followed by President Barack Obama, followed now by Donald Trump, each of those 4 presidents has had a different stance vis-a-vis the topic of race. And that leadership or lack thereof has made a difference in terms of how we think and talk about those issues in our nation. And currently, we are in a position where the rhetoric has led to considerable polarization. I think most people will agree that we are living in a very polarized time. And then the 4th P is psychology. And over the last 20 years, there are actually some ideas in psychology that really inform how we think about racism and how it impacts people that were not part of the conversation when I wrote the book the first time. So I really wanted to reflect on all 4 of those Ps.
I really want to get to the psychology part, but first I just want to acknowledge how valuable it was to see the historical framework that you put in those new 70 pages. And I think it's something that all of us, whatever our discipline, psychology, education, social work, public health, to really have that grounding in our work is really helpful, because we are not just starting from now. We have a lot of history behind us. So, maybe talk a little bit about, your thoughtfulness in building those first pages around.
Sure. So it's probably the longest prologue in publishing history. When I was working on, when I had the idea and the publisher and I talked about doing a 20th anniversary update, I wasn't sure exactly at the beginning how much would need to be changed. As it turns out, a great deal of the book was rewritten. But I started by just reflecting on, well, what has happened in the last 20 years? And that was really an interesting exercise for me. I mean, to just reflect on the pivotal moments, and then to think about those pivotal moments through the lens of somebody who is 20 years old, right, or in their early 20s. Because that was really part of what a question I was asking myself is, how are these issues experienced by today's students? When I was writing the book back in 1996, I was writing through the lens of the students I was teaching, who were traditionally aged students for the most part. So they were students that, in 1997 were 18, 19, 20. Fast forward 20 years, those people are in their 40s, right? And so what would today's 20-year-olds be thinking and saying about these issues? So I was thinking about that question, and then I really started to look at the timeline, and it was fascinating to me to reflect on that. And I just invite the audience to think about this with us. Think about when you were born, whoever you are in the audience, and what were the key historical moments that you remember, right? If you were born in 1997, the first of those that I thought about was, for that cohort born in 1997, was 9/11, which happened in 2001, right? And so if you were born in 1997, you were 4 years old then, you might not remember it, but all of the post 9/11 changes that took place in American society, the anti-Muslim rhetoric, the fear of the other that got amplified during that time, moving into war. Let me just say this, that in 1997, Bill Clinton was president. And he launched something in the fall of 1997, coincidentally, the same time that my book was coming out, his President's Initiative on Race. I'm curious how many in this audience are old enough to remember. You might be old enough, but you might not remember. So let me ask you, raise your hand if you remember President Clinton's Initiative on Race. Some of you do, just a few hands. Even when you're talking to a room full of baby boomers, not everyone will raise their hand. And because, I'll tell you why I think we don't remember it, in December of 1997, Bill Clinton launched what he called his President's Initiative on Race. And he said at a town hall meeting at the University of Akron that he thought it was important for the nation to really focus on the issue, the sort of the legacy of race and racism in our society, and that it was a good time to do it, he said, because we're a nation at peace and we are experiencing prosperity. And he said, it's when you're at, we're not at war with anyone, the economy's good, it's when things are going well that you can take on tough issues. Now, what happened? About a month later, he was embroiled in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and nobody heard about that initiative on race because we were reading all about, the scandal and his impeachment and all of that. It got really overshadowed, which is why I think most people don't remember it. But if we take his point that when things are going well, it's a good time to take on a tough topic. Fast forward to 2001, now we're under attack. It's 9/11. The rhetoric is, hostile toward that foreign threat, so to speak. And now we're not a nation at peace, we're a nation at war. And at the same time, so that context is shaping the rhetoric that those 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds are hearing growing up. And then fast forward to 7 years later, 2008. So when we think about 2008, there are two things that are important there. The first is the loss of prosperity, right? President Clinton said you need peace and you need prosperity. We don't have peace, and then the economy collapses. The Great Recession happens. The financial markets fall apart. Many people are experiencing unemployment, or their houses are underwater, or maybe they're dealing with foreclosure. And certainly that was true, much more difficult circumstances in Black and brown communities. So now, if you were born in 1997, you are in 2008, you're 11 years old, and certainly aware perhaps of family pressures around economy and concerns about just family material well-being. But fast forward a few more months, and then it's the election of President Barack Obama. And I'm imagining that many people here will remember where you were on the night of 2008 when his election was announced. That's a memorable moment. If you were 11 when that was happening, you might remember that people started saying, we are now in a post-racial era, right? We don't have to worry about racism anymore. America has overcome its biggest challenge, right? Because look what we've done. We've elected an African-American president. And even people who said that they did not originally support President Obama said in a survey done by USA Today shortly after the election, like the weekend after the election, that they were proud that the United States had done this thing, even if that was not the person that they were supporting. However, there were 26% of the respondents who said they were frightened by the election result and concerned about that. And we certainly saw immediately after his election the rapid rise in visibility of white nationalist activity. In fact, the largest surge in memberships on a white nationalist website called stormfront.org happened the day after President Obama's election. So all of this is to say that on the one hand, there's this undercurrent of rising white nationalism, white supremacy, ideology, and rhetoric, but also this sense of, okay, no worries, post-racial. That's in 2008. But fast forward now to 2012, and our same student is now 15. And what happens that year is the murder of Trayvon Martin and the beginnings of what becomes the Black Lives Matter movement. And whether you identify with Trayvon Martin because you too are a young African American, or maybe you're just watching it on the news from the vantage point of someone who is not African American, still the impact of that, I'm just thinking back to social media and all the pictures I saw of young people in hoodies, identifying with Trayvon Martin and the protesting that was starting to happen on campuses. and that's part of that socialization experience too. So on the one hand, you've got 2008 to 2016, 8 years from 11 to 19, witnessing the leadership of an African American president, a black president in the White House. You also have this other stuff that is happening despite the fact that we have a black president. Despite the fact that we have a black president, we have all these police shootings. You know, shortly after the Trayvon Martin incident is, you know, just a couple years later, Michael Brown, the uprising in Ferguson, not to mention all the others, you know, Freddie Gray, Philander Smith, you know, so many. So anyway, to make a long story short, the tension around these competing narratives. Yes, we're post-racial. It doesn't look that way, you know, on social media with all of this happening and the criminal justice, what seems to be injustice, playing itself out. And now you're entering college. You're just about college age, and now it's 2016. Maybe you're voting for the first time or not. Hopefully you are voting, but we know a lot of young people didn't vote. And we have this very divisive national campaign, presidential campaign. Even before the result was known, there was a lot of polarizing rhetoric, as we know. And particularly coming from the Trump campaign around, you know, maligning immigrants and particularly Mexicans, but not only, you know, speaking about African American communities, anti-Muslim rhetoric, all of that stuff. And so we find ourselves then with a result that surprised many people. And then certainly in Massachusetts, I was here in Massachusetts speaking the day of the election. I had voted early in Georgia, where I live now, and I was remembering being asked by someone in the audience, you know, what will we do if Donald Trump is elected? And I said, I really don't think that's going to happen.
I wish you were right.
I wish I was right too. So I got home from that event, came home, I would get home about 8 o'clock, having flown home from Boston, turned on the news. I was watching the news and saw the election returns. And, you know, it was a long day and I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was about midnight. And it was still the returns. But what I saw at 8 was different than what I saw at midnight. I was like, what happened? I mean, you know, it was just shocking to me. But all of that to say, the tone that has, you know, in the nation that has shifted since that election. I mean, think about this. In January, after, right around the time of the inauguration, there was a white supremacist parade down Pennsylvania Avenue celebrating the election of Donald Trump. These are things that in 1997 I would not have anticipated, but are the factors that have shaped the thinking of the 22-year-olds we now see today. And I think it's important to think about that because if I think about my life experience in 1954, mostly it's been progress, right? You know, mostly it's been, you know, Voting Rights Act, and it's been, the consequences of the civil rights era and the expanding opportunities for people of color, particularly African Americans. And if you're born in 1997, what you see is not a march of progress, but sort of a march backwards. And that, I think, shapes how you view the world in ways that are really important.
I think for, you know, people of color, you know, young people, all of us, you know, I feel like it's more of gaslighting. So if you go into the deep psychology of it, to feel that going backwards, to hear messages that everything is good, well, you know, I think that's very troubling. And it takes a lot of psychic energy that could be used for other things. So I'm really interested in how psychology can help us understand for people of color, but also to understand, you know, one of the really important chapters in your book is how does racism hurt white people of privilege? And if we can get to that part too, that it hurts all of us,
Yes.
maybe we can make some movement.
Sure. Well, certainly it's very clear to me that racism does hurt everyone. If we think about the lost opportunity for progress, lost opportunity for connection, and the sort of collective sense of repression, using a psychology term, that we all, that many white people in particular are dealing with. And so you might ask, what do I mean by that? And I want to take this opportunity to illustrate it with our audience, if I might. So I want to ask the audience to think about your own earliest race-related memory. Just go back and what's the first race-related memory that you would call up if you were really focused on it? And knowing that I'm not going to call on anybody to tell it, I just would like you to raise your hand if you've thought of something. Okay, almost everybody has. And so now the question I want to ask is, how old were you at the time of this incident you have remembered? You can either hold up fingers, because if you're younger than 10, that will work, 10 or younger, or you can call out ages if you're older than 10. Okay, so I heard somebody say high school, but I see I got 4s, a lot of 4s, some 9s. I got high school, 6s, a lot of 5s. Anybody got a 3? I saw a 3. Did anyone have 2? Okay, one person's got a 2-year-old memory, but most people are 3 or older. I saw a lot of 5s and 6s and 7s. Raise your hand if that's you. You're a 5, 6, or a 7. Okay, a lot of 5, 6, and 7s. And even if you were 8, 9, or 10, it's mostly elementary school age. I did hear that some people have a high school memory. So let me now ask, and this is going to require you to call out some words. What emotion is attached to that experience? Okay, I heard fear, embarrassment, pain. I thought I heard shame, anger, surprise, confusion. Anything else someone wants to say? Vulnerable. Okay, so just to repeat, I heard fear, anger, I think I heard sadness, shame, confusion, vulnerable, pain. Sometimes people say things like curiosity, or sometimes people say love, because maybe it was in a context of a caring relationship. But mostly the words we heard here are the kind of words I always hear. Embarrassment, upsetness of some kind. And, I think we would all agree that things like fear, anger, shame, embarrassment, pain, those are things we seek to avoid. Nobody wants to feel those things. So now my question is, did you share this experience? Did you talk to a concerned adult, a parent or a teacher maybe, about the incident at the time that it occurred? I'm already seeing some heads going no, but I want to just ask, you can raise your hand. Raise your hand if you did have a conversation. Okay, so maybe, 24 people did. Raise your hand if you did not. You can easily see many more people did not. So how many of you have some personal experience with 5, 6, or 7-year-olds? Siblings, kids you babysat for, people you taught, your own children? Okay, a lot of you know kids that age or have had experience with them, and see if you agree, they are pretty candid. Mm-hmm. They're chatty, they blurt stuff out. They don't filter too much. But here we have an audience, hundreds of people in this room, who say, I was the age when people don't filter much. I had an upsetting experience. I still remember many years ago, and yet I did not talk to anybody about it. So that's counterintuitive. And so why is that? What do you think? My fault? It was my fault. So something I did was my fault, and therefore I'm not going to tell it because that would be bad for me. It wasn't encouraged. In the back. Your parents were the ones you saw doing it. Sometimes the parent is the source of the confusion or the upsetness. Yeah. So there are lots of reasons. Sometimes, as we just heard, sometimes it's the caring or concerned adult that is the source of the problem and therefore can't be talked to about. Sometimes it's not encouraged. Sometimes, I won't even say it's not encouraged, sometimes it's actively discouraged. Mm-hmm. And I think many people learn at a very early age, you're not supposed to talk about something, right? You're not supposed to talk about these questions. In my talk that Reggie referenced at the very beginning, my TEDx talk, which is called, Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? I talk about how to have conversations about race with young children. But one of the things that often people will tell you is that, you know, my son said something, my daughter said something, and my first response was, shh. You know, that the impulse is to hush the child about the observation they're making or the thing that they are asking about. But if we think about the fact that these are daily experiences, that thing you remember is not the only thing you remember, am I right? Yeah, these are experiences that happen with some regularity, and yet we are taught or learn early we're not supposed to talk about it. Means that we spend a lot of psychic energy not noticing. We have to teach ourselves to not notice, to not comment, to repress that information, and that takes up a lot of psychological energy. One of the things that I learned when I was doing professional development with teachers in the greater Boston area, I had the opportunity to do that in the 90s, and some of the examples from those teachers are in my book. And one of the things that, and these were mostly white teachers working in suburban school districts that participated in the METCO program. People in this audience, I think, know that METCO is a voluntary school desegregation program where Boston kids, Black and Latinx Boston kids are typically bused into suburban, mostly white school districts. And the teaching staff in those districts is talked about how liberating it was to be able to have conversations about race. And it was so interesting to me. I and one of my graduate students at Mount Holyoke did a research project interviewing white educators who became anti-racist facilitators in a school project. And we were asking them what was the personal impact. And they kept saying, it's like I have a new lease on life. It is so energizing. They kept using this phrase, I have more energy since I've started doing this, I have more energy. And I started to wonder, like, why would people use that phrase? Mm-hmm. Like, you know, it's so energizing. I feel like I have more energy. And then I thought about how much energy we spend not talking about it. And that when, I mean, it's kind of like if I said, you know, there's an elephant sitting up here with Michelle and me, but please don't notice. Mm-hmm. You know, like work very hard to pretend that elephant's not there. That would take up a lot of cognitive bandwidth, right? Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, but then if I said, not only can you notice, but I want you to talk about it and let's see if we can do something to move it off the stage. You know, that would require you to use some of that cognitive bandwidth, but in a way that was easier than just trying to pretend it wasn't there. When we think about what it means to pretend it's not there in terms of the way it limits our own capacity to process information, I mean, from a psychological point of view, that's a cost everybody's paying.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to let people come up to the mic while I ask the next question, if other people have questions. And just to say, my son who's 14 and doesn't do anything but grunt, last night we were driving home and I said, oh, I'm going to be moderating this talk with Dr. Beverly Tatum, who wrote Why Are Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? He never says a word. He peeps up and says, oh yeah, me and my friends do that. And I said, why? And he's like, we just do. And I'm trying to get at the psychological pieces of it. But I know he feels better. So I just want to recognize and have you talk a little bit about the healing of affirmative spaces. And I think about, had a number of Metco students in my research projects, and as soon as they're done, they're headed to a historically black college or university. And I think maybe they're going to be, feeling better after that experience in Newton or wherever they were.
Yes.
So maybe,
Yeah, there's two things I want to say about that. One is that, we all want to be affirmed for who we are, right? So I often talk about what I call the ABCs. A stands for affirming identity, B stands for building community, C stands for cultivating leadership. And I'm happy to talk about each of those things, but relative to the question of sitting together, we all want to be seen, heard, and understood for who we are. And often, if you are in a marginalized, stigmatized group, you don't have that experience. Sometimes you're just overlooked. You raise your hand, you're not called on. Sometimes you are stereotyped in particular ways, or you're made visible in ways that you don't want to be, like you're tired of having people ask you about your hair, or whatever it might be. And so when you have the opportunity to be in a space where people have a shared experience, where they know what it's like to have those questions asked, where they understand what it means to be the only one in the physics class, who is trying to figure things out and are hesitant to ask questions because of stereotype threat in that space. Whatever it might be, there's a real positive impact of having the opportunity to connect with folks who understand where you're coming from and where you don't have to explain yourself, where you can just be yourself and relax. I know that I speak a lot on college campuses, as I am today, and sometimes people will say, well, if students are in those, quote, safe spaces, they won't fully engage with the wider community. And that's, we want diversity in our community. We want our students to engage with each other. And I often point out, actually the research tells us otherwise, that those opportunities, those cultural spaces, those affinity groups function like I actually don't like the phrase safe spaces. They function as refueling spaces or like recharging spaces. If you're out expending energy, you need to recharge in some way. And for lots of students, that's where they recharge. And the research, the higher ed research tells us that students who are actively engaged in those kinds of organizations are also the same students that are often most likely providing leadership in other parts of the campus because they have a place to refuel. The one place where affinity groups don't seem to function very well is actually in majority white spaces known as fraternities and sororities. Historically white fraternities and sororities, according to the higher ed research, suggests that students who are actively involved in those organizations are the least likely of campus groups to connect across lines of difference because they become quite insulated and don't move beyond the boundaries of those communities. So if we're thinking from a structural point of view, how to expand cross-group connection, we don't want to do it by trying to eliminate the affinity groups of the marginalized groups. We might want to think about how we minimize the impact of those historically white organizations.
Thank you. Oh, here we go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tatum, for your writings and your thoughtful discussion on race. Just by way of introduction, my name is Joseph Feaster. I am a past president of the Boston branch NAACP and currently the chairman of the board of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. What you were saying is quite interesting, and some of our METCO colleagues are here. My children were at METCO in Newton, And when we talk about trying to, what should we tell to our young folks who are in those situations where they are in predominantly white schools? My grandson, who is 9, is in a private school, and we have that conversation. See, I grew up in New York, born in the Bronx, raised in Queens, worked in Brooklyn, partied in Manhattan. And my mother was very affirming in terms of talking about it. My own incident occurred when I went to a high school in an area called Astoria, where Donald Trump's father made all his money. Went to Astoria, and as I was getting on the buses, garbage cans were thrown at us. I was about 14 years old. My question to you would be, having a grandson who is 9 years old, we have the conversation about race with him all the time because of that environment, 4th grade, he needs to learn that. What would you say to parents of color who have their children in those types of environment? What should the conversation, what should the dialogue be to prepare that child to matriculate through that system where they are in the minority?
Well, I think that my first response as I'm listening to your question is not so much what to say to the kid, what to say to the school, right? You know, which is to say that it's important for the school to acknowledge the fact that there is a diverse student population and how are they preparing for that population, right? So the first thing I would say to the parent is make yourself known at the school, right? Be visible and, you know, get to know the principal, meet the teacher, do your own assessment. But here's the thing. I'm going to go back to my ABCs relative to your question. So when I talk about affirming identity, I want to illustrate this in a very tangible way. Let's imagine that we had a photographer up here. Michelle is a photographer, but her camera's over there. Let's imagine that we had a photographer here taking a group shot of all of you here today. And at the end of our time together, you got a copy of that photo. What is the first thing you're going to do when you get that photo? Look for yourself. That is the only honest answer to that question. Right? Right? You are going to look for yourself. And so let's imagine that every 10th person has been digitally removed from the picture. You know, someone decided it looked too crowded, and so they took out every 10th person. And so you're looking at your picture, and you're like, I was sitting right there. But, you know, I see the guy I was sitting next to. I see the person on the other side of me. I'm missing from this picture. You would say, what's wrong with this picture, right? But let's imagine this happens to you all the time. Everywhere you go, it just happens that you're the one who gets digitally removed from the picture. After a while, you're not going to say, what's wrong with this picture? You're going to say, what's wrong with me? Am I invisible? Why is it that I'm never included in the photos? And let's imagine we asked you to stay a little bit longer. You got somewhere to go, lunch, whatever it is, and we say, please don't leave, we're going to take a picture. If you are accustomed to always being left out, you're not going to hang around, right? You're going to beat the crowd to the parking lot or wherever it is you need to be. And so what does this mean in that context? When we enter spaces, schools, work, wherever we are, when we walk into a group of people, the first thing we do, like looking at a photograph, is look to see if we see ourselves in it. Right? You know, is this a room in which I feel like I'm going to belong? Are people like me in this space? So if I'm 9 and I'm walking into a school building, I'm going to describe a school that I had this experience. I walked into the main office, you know, the main area. This happened to be a private school, but I walked in, and in the main lobby of this administration building, there were portraits of people who'd been significant to the school's past, maybe previous heads of school or board members or whatever, all white men. And across the top was a wooden banner that had a saying engraved in it, and it said, "Be true to your heritage." Now let's imagine you walk in, you're 9 and you're a young black kid with your parents, and they're deciding whether they want you to go to that school or not. if you're looking for yourself in those pictures, you're not finding it, right? And the thing says, be true to your heritage. Well, whose heritage are we talking about, and what exactly does that mean? You know, there are lots of questions being raised. Now, you know, public institutions, not likely to see that, but what do you see? Whose pictures do you see? What is being lifted up as symbols of the institution? Who do you see in the classroom? Who do you see in the textbook? Who do you see whose work is being, you know, up on the walls as you move around the building? Even if there aren't very many black kids in the school or other kids of color in the school, it's possible to make a diverse population visible through the, you know, the what's being celebrated, what images and pictures and curriculum, and, you know, are we reading the 1619 New York Times magazine in my class? You know, all of those things tell you about whether you matter or not. So the first thing I would say to the parent is go and see whether your kid's gonna be reflected, and if not, ask questions. Because if they're not, they could be. Changes can be made, right? But those changes are not likely to be made unless there are parents raising questions about it. And so that's my first piece of advice. And then the benefit of that to the 9-year-old is to see parents advocating, you know, change is possible. This may not be what we want it to be today, but we can change it. We have agency in this situation. And I find that kids, you know, that on the one hand, you don't want to, you know, I would not say to my children, you know, let me know if somebody calls you a name, right? Because that sets them up, right, you know, for a potential, to expectation that bad things are going to happen. But on the other hand, to say, you know, I think it's important that everybody be represented, and so this is what I'm doing to see that that happens. And, you know, I really want to know, tell me how your day was. And to be listening for cues that maybe there's something that's not going right, or, you know. And if I get that information, then I want to not only help my child process it, but also understand it as something that has to do with the external environment, not the internal person you are, right? That's that other person's problem. So, so the A, affirming identity, is really critical to creating environments where students feel fully engaged. And if we want them to feel fully engaged, we have to make sure they, you know, sense of belonging is, whether you have a sense of belonging is the best predictor of whether you're going to persist in an environment. And the B, since I mentioned it, I want to talk about building community. A lot of times schools will do things to try to build community. Taking a group photo is a community building activity. But it's only going to work if people are convinced that they're going to actively be included, right? So you can't do the B effectively without thinking in an intentional way about the A, affirming identity. I want to just give a quick Spelman example because it's easy to see how, I mean, what good intentions, people are well-intentioned. When I first arrived at Spelman in the summer of 2002, everybody was getting ready to receive the incoming class of 2006. There was a big banner and it said, welcome, class of 2006. That is welcoming, except if you're not in the class of 2006, right? You know, if you're a transfer student, you feel invisible. That picture doesn't include you. Nobody puts up a sign that says welcome and trying to leave people out. But if you say welcome, class of 2006, you inevitably leave out people who are not going to graduate in 06. It's an easy fix. Now the sign says, welcome, new students, right? And so, but whether you're thinking about who's included, who's missing from the picture, that, if you remember one thing from this talk, I hope it will be to ask yourself, who's missing from this picture? If you get in the habit of doing that, you're more likely to include people than to leave them out by accident. And so the B and the A really have to go together. The C is really about, you know, as we think about our responsibility as educators, is really about how do we prepare the next generation of leaders to think in an inclusive way, cultivating leadership, for the 21st century. You cannot be an effective leader in the 21st century if you don't know how to engage effectively with people different from yourself. And this comes back to your question about how does racism hurt white people. If you're one of the 75% of white Americans who don't have diverse social networks, you're living in a little isolated bubble and you don't know how to connect across lines of difference. And inevitably, if you move out of that bubble into a diverse workplace or a school setting, you are likely to be unprepared to be effective in that setting. If your kids are growing up in that socially isolated way and they don't have any intervention, they are in essence going to be social dinosaurs. And that good school that you think they're in is not preparing them. So the C is really about how do we prepare the next generation of students to be able to do what they're going to need to do in a world where in just a few years there won't be a dominant group, right? There won't be, just from a numbers point of view, there won't be, it'll be a plurality, there won't be a majority.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ranuma Kabir. I'm a junior here at undergrad. I'm double majoring in biology and anthropology. Currently on the pre-med track, but I am strongly debating on education, which is why I'm here.
Yay.
So my question is that, so you've had experience teaching at Mount Holyoke, which is PWI, primarily white institution, and then you've been president of Spelman College, which is a HBCU.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to figure out is how you approach these students when you have conversations with them or teaching them in terms of developing racial identities. And so, like, what was your experience back then, and how do you perceive that when I become an educator, how I would have to approach these students that look different from me, but I still want them to feel included in the classroom?
Sure. Well, I'm going to say that the A, affirming identity, is something for you to think about in terms of, when you're trying to include people in the classroom, you have to ask, who's missing from this picture, right? So if you if you're asking me, like, how did we think about that at Spelman? Spelman, as a historically black college for women, is one of the few places where a young woman of African descent can say, this place was built for me, right? So when she arrives, she's not wondering, do I fit in here? I mean, everybody wonders, do I fit in a space, right? But she's not wondering, is this a place where I, a young black woman, am going to be accepted? It was designed for young black women, right? Which is one of the reasons why, 9,000 of them apply every year for 500 spaces. So the fact is that there's a real desire to be part of that community. But having said that, you might say, well, is every student a woman of African descent? Not everyone is. Most of them are, but not all of them. And even if they all were, they're not all the same. Someone said, like, well, what diversity issues do you have at an HBCU? Plenty, right? Plenty. And so you might say, well, here's one. Spelman College was founded by 2 Christian missionaries, white women from Massachusetts, founded Spelman in 1881, and coming out of that Christian missionary ethos, they created a motto for their school, and the school motto is our whole school for Christ. Well, what does that mean if you're not Christian, right? What does that mean if you're a Muslim student? What does that mean if you're Baha'i or Hindu or Jewish or not believing in anything, So that doesn't mean that the motto of the school needs to change. The motto has historic meaning and value, but what's the 21st century implementation of that motto? I used to talk about this a lot, as you can probably hear. And I would talk about the fact that that motto means we have to be welcoming for everyone, right? And that at the heart of Christianity, speaking as a Christian, is the idea that everyone should be at the welcome table, right? Now, I know that it's not always operationalized in that way, so we can have theological conversations later. That said, we should have an environment where everyone feels welcome. So what does that mean? Well, maybe it means that the Muslim students get to read from the Quran at the baccalaureate, right? Maybe it means that we are going to celebrate an iftar at the end of Ramadan. Maybe it means that, and that's just one kind of difference. We could talk about sexual orientation. We could talk about socioeconomic status. We could talk about the fact that your experience growing up as a young black woman in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, I can tell you, is different than growing up in the Bronx, you know, or in rural Georgia. You know, so people have different life experiences, and we want to make space for all of those experiences. And the way we do that is by acknowledging that those differences exist and trying to make different voices visible.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tyrone Porter. I'm faculty in mechanical engineering here at Boston University. And I actually was one of the 20-year-olds that you mentioned at the start that was impacted heavily by your book in the mid to late 90s. And I was out in Seattle at that point in time when anti-affirmative action was moving up the coast of California. So we talked a lot. We read as students and really challenged the faculty and the leadership to really think beyond the traditional ways of recruiting students and keeping students, retaining students. My question for you is, as you mentioned, times have changed.
Yeah.
Times have changed dramatically. And screen time in particular, a lot more, social media was really not, it was in its infancy way back then. I still remember the black and green screen I used to use for sending emails, which is dormant nowadays. So screen time is actually taking up more time than people time. And you can actually tune in to a channel or a website or a location that reinforces your own beliefs.
Absolutely.
And or ignorance or naivety. I occasionally will watch, after popping some antacids and Tums, Fox News, just to see what the rhetoric is like on that channel compared to CNN or MSNBC. And it's totally different. Everything is characterized completely different. So how in this day and age, which is different from when you first wrote the book, how do you actually facilitate and drive a conversation where people can literally say, I don't even want to hear you. I'm going to go back into my own little bubble. You talked about the bubble. You can intentionally go into that bubble and just close off the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, this is why I think spaces like Boston University and higher education institutions in general are so critical, because the classroom is one of the places where you can pop the bubble, right? And by that, I don't mean, you know, become ideological in the classroom, but create spaces where multiple voices are represented and where people have to dialogue with each other, and where you can teach the critical analysis, you know, the skills of critical analysis, critical thinking, so that students can recognize the difference between fact and propaganda, or test those hypotheses for themselves. It's challenging, you know, and I have, certainly in my role as president, have heard from faculty who will say, you know, I'm teaching X, Y, or Z, and students in my class want to challenge me on the basis of something they saw on social media, and, you know, what am I supposed to do about that? Well, what you're supposed to do about that, and I'm not trying to say it as though it's simple, is to help students read critically and check references and understand what's the difference between what they are seeing and how they know whether something is legitimate or not. You know, how do you test what's a reliable source? And thinking about those questions. So that's an opportunity that we have in classrooms that we need to be using. But also in my book, I talk a lot about the value of structured dialogue on college campuses that allows students of differing life experiences to engage with one another over time. And the value of a semester is that you bring people together over time. And why does that matter? Because there's what I call the arc of discomfort, right? If you have, let's say it's orientation, and you're having a workshop during orientation to address issues of diversity, and that's how you're going to do it on your campus, what you can predict is that it's going to be just enough to make some people uncomfortable, but not enough to give them time to work through that discomfort. And if you stop when people are at their peak of discomfort, what it tells them is, if I avoid these things, I don't have to be uncomfortable, right? But if you've got them in a semester where they're feeling discomfort, the fact is it's too late to drop. You have to, you have to keep at it, right? And what happens is, this is what my experience was, what happens is, yes, there's discomfort. Yes, people get tired of talking about it. Yes, they tell you you don't want to see another film, but then they're like, you know what? I'm starting to see what the issues are here. And now I had a conversation with my roommate that I wouldn't have been able to have last month, and it actually felt pretty good. I'm starting to get some of that energy you were talking about, right? And so, but that takes time. But that's one of the things we have in an institution of higher education. We have a time period and an audience of people who can be brought together. It's the most diverse audience that most of the kids in that classroom will have experienced in their lives. And if we don't capitalize on that opportunity, we really will have missed the boat.
Great advice.
Thanks.
We have a few more minutes, so it's only, I think we have time for one more question.
Oh,
Or not really?
somebody else can go.
Two more
Two.
questions.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay,
Thank
we-
you. Go ahead.
Are you sure you're giving up your spot?
Yeah, I truly
Okay.
All right.
appreciate it. Thank you. Dr. Tatum, your work is phenomenal. I
Thank you.
read your work as a young teacher when I was in my mid-20s, and it was groundbreaking for me. It was a way of being reaffirmed in a way, and also educating students who look like me and working within faculty who are mostly white, trying to help. It was just affirming to be able to explain to the kids and to the faculty, now do you see why these things are happening? It doesn't mean that there's bad things happening in the minds of the kids. But your work has really created a fracture in the iceberg of like racism and misunderstanding and hatred, and I'm thankful that you are here and you're doing this work. So my question is, I'm in my 20th year of education. I'm a doc student here. Hopefully I'll be a Dr. Carter at the end of the school year.
Congratulations.
And I've worked in schools and I've actually led a school, and in all probability, the school will have a faculty that is mostly white. And so what advice would you give a young educator or an older educator, male or female, of color, when they take over a school that's mostly white with some faculty who are wanting to do more and others who are either ignorant or don't want to do more or oblivious? How do you lead those educators to change, because they're the ones who are going to help the next generation of students of color and white students shift this frame?
So I am a big fan of professional development, ongoing professional development, and as I said, I've done a lot of it earlier in my life and saw the benefit of that in terms of, veteran teachers, some new teachers, some veteran teachers, really start to shift their perspective as the result of having semestral, again, time is important, right? The one shot, experience, somebody speaks and that's the end, doesn't really do much for you. But if you have book study groups or opportunities for people in an ongoing way to engage these issues, sometimes you have faculty who can be leaders. That was one of the things that we were doing, was training the trainers so that they could go back into their school communities and facilitate these conversations, and that was a really, I think, useful thing. But I have seen, real benefits come from that kind of ongoing professional development and support, and so I would be thinking about how to do that. Now, it's sometimes hard to do it yourself, right? So you can be the, as the school leader, you can create the circumstances under which it can happen. Maybe you can do some of it, but sometimes for other, for lots of reasons, it can be complicated to be the one that people have to report to, and also the one that's asking people to have these important and hard to have conversations. But, but there are a lot, if I had 2 book recommendations, I would recommend the following books. Based on, besides not counting my own. I would really recommend.
Understood.
3 recommendations.
Yes, yeah. The first one is a given, right? But I would certainly recommend to white readership Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, which I think is really a useful book and helps give some self-awareness. That's been my observation. And I'm really liking Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I want to say, you know, that in his book, there's a lot of good things in his book, but one of the things in his book is that he makes an analogy of racism to cancer, right? And he talks about that we should deal with racism in our society like we deal with cancer. And he speaks from that perspective as someone who was diagnosed and is now a cancer survivor, right? And he says, you know, racism, like cancer, should be detected early, right? You know, you want to detect it early, and when you detect it, you want to excise it, right? You want to get it out of your system as quickly as you can. But even if you're successful in doing that, you know, you look at the policies and the practices in your school and you have made the changes, you can't assume that it won't ever come back. So you have to be vigilant and watching for it, and then if you see signs of it returning, you have to treat it aggressively. And I think it's a great analogy, you know, because sometimes people will say something is either racist or not racist as though it's a permanent condition. And I think that that's part of the struggle we're having in our society. I think some people thought, oh, we fixed that. Students used to say that to me. Oh, is there still racism? I thought we fixed that. Even if we did fix it, which we didn't, but even if we did, it doesn't mean it can't come back. And we have to be vigilant and really work hard. But it's not about looking for people. It's about like who's the racist and who's not. It's about looking for policies and practices that are, you know, leaving students feeling isolated or not included or underachieving because the expectations are low, et cetera.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Dr. Holly Carter, and I'm standing here with pride because that's my son.
Who knew? That's great.
And I was the second black woman to get my PhD from MIT. And it took me a long time to be able to say that because I was also a little girl in the housing project behind MIT who couldn't even envision that as a possibility. I'm so grateful for the work that you have done, and it's guided my work in doing diversity, inclusion, training, and research, and teaching for the last 50 years of my life. I'm torn now, because on the one hand, I've done a lot of work with training white teachers and white professionals about how to exercise their own growth in terms of anti-racism. But of late, I've been thinking and doing work about the black children who are sitting together in the cafeteria and the impact of racism on them in terms of how they see each other. Not how they see themselves relative to the whites sitting around looking at the circle, but how they see each other. And I'm doing now a session in my church on looking at racism from a Christian perspective. And one of the things I talked about is this line of humanity and looking at what's happening below that line. How within the context of communities, not just communities of color, but all communities who find themselves below the line, they wind up treating themselves much the same way as they are treated from above. My question is, how do you then talk to those black children in the cafeteria who are sitting together and treat each other much the same way as they are treated by the majority culture around them, and don't recognize that that's because of the legacy of racism that they hold inside?
Yeah, so I have a very concrete example of this, and I'm sorry we don't have it up on the screen, But there is an image that I have used for many years, which we call the cycle of racism, right? Or a cycle of, so let's just imagine this. Let's imagine we've got a circle, and at one point of the circle, we have what we call our early years. And young children are absorbing information, misinformation, stereotypes, omissions, distortions. And that is just part of, the air we're breathing. We're hearing the jokes people tell, we're watching television, we're seeing the images. We're all learning those messages that create what I'm going to call a hierarchy of human value, right? That some people are smarter than other people, some people are better than other people, that's part of the messages we all get growing up. And that then those messages get reinforced. So now it's another part of our circle over here, is how those messages get reinforced by people we know, love, and trust. Our parents, our teachers, trusted individuals on the news. There's lots of ways that some of those early things get reinforced. And then because it's being reinforced at school, maybe in church, let's just use church as an example in terms of, the images. What are, you're sitting in church as a young person of color, but are the images of Jesus white and blonde? Not historically accurate, I think we can all agree. If you live in the Middle East, you're not likely to be pale and blonde. But at any rate, and not if you were born there, at any rate, the fact of the matter is there's lots of ways in which these messages get reinforced. You internalize those messages. You come to see differences, not different but equal. This is my bottom circle here. You see, this is the internalization. You see difference as not different but equal, but difference as wrong or abnormal, right? And that's kind of how we internalize that. And then we go on to reinforce it with the next generation because we teach what we were taught. So you see this like circle. If we were looking at that circle, we would also see that there's a little arrow off to the side. That arrow is the path to interrupt the cycle. When we experience cognitive dissonance, when we realize, I don't want to do it the way I was taught, I want to interrupt that process, we try to step off that cycle. Okay, so let's imagine we had that visual up here on the screen, and we were talking to fifth graders. You can talk to fifth graders about that cycle. You can talk to certainly eighth graders or ninth graders, high school students about that cycle. And you can talk about the fact that sometimes with our own behavior, we reinforce that cycle or we're interrupting it. It's one or the other. There's sort of no neutral ground here. You're either reinforcing that cycle or you're interrupting it. And then if you've got that cognitive frame, you can talk to young people about, is it your intention to reinforce those stereotypes? Is that what you were really intending to do? Is it your intention to reinforce that notion that some people are better than others? When I hear you use that language, that's what I'm thinking you're doing. Is that your intention? To sort of make it visible in a metacognitive way, to have those conversations. And sometimes it's easier to have that conversation in an affinity group than in a mixed group because you can sort of speak more directly to, what does it mean? I'm just going to use an example, like, to talk about some hair is good hair. What does that mean? Is that really what you intended to say? Or assumptions about, skin color and the value associated with different shades. Where do those ideas come from? Let's rewind and think about the messages that we've been getting over a long time. And is that really what we want to be doing to each other? And those are conversations that you can have with middle schoolers and high schoolers. I've known some teachers who've taught that cycle to even third and fourth graders so that they can think about how they are either reinforcing it or interrupting it. And I found that to be a powerful intervention.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry to say our conversation up here has come to a close.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Everybody knows what 3 books to get. If you haven't picked up Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, we have some books for sale, and there'll be book signing. And I just can't thank you enough, Dr. Tatum, for just not only sharing your wisdom, but giving us some actual actionable tips that we can go back and use when we work back in our communities. For us, for many of us here from Wheelock, you know, training teachers, and so thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really good. Thank you all. Okay, so shall we exit?
Well, this
right?
has been a wonderful experience. So why don't we have a couple of things to do before we close, but we'll ask Dr. Tatum and Michelle Porche if you want to start heading outside.
Okay.
For the book signing, that'd be great. I want to make sure to recognize some additional folks, including Dr. Porche for her moderation. So let's give her a round of applause. I also want to recognize Dr. Raul Fernandez, too, for providing a welcome for us. Some folks behind the scenes who are very helpful: Jenny Hopkins, Mary Ellen Amadeo, for their tireless help with making this event possible. BU Wheelock Dean's host, especially Hannah Goti. BU Wheelock Marcom office, Jonathan Lazaro, Paige Kelly, and Steve Roeder, who works at BU Wheelock. I also want to thank Dan Benedetti and the Pickering Library for making sure the book was available. And finally, I want to thank my wife, Ruthie, for all her support in helping me. Yeah, she deserves a round of applause. So, I also want to point out, hopefully this clicker works. If you can, up there, if you can go to 2 slides. There's a couple of events that are upcoming, so I want to make sure to market those. So before we show that slide, there's a couple of students, professors who work to get students credit for coming to this event. If you're a student here who needs a slip, come see me afterwards for that. And then before you took your seats, there was 2 Post-its that were put underneath the seat that says winner. If you have a Post-it under your seat, you're getting a free copy of the book. So, one over there, great. Karina. And one over there, great. So, so you guys can come up, I'll give you the book. And then if you want to purchase a book, it's in this, the auditorium next to us, the hall next to us, and then we'll do the signing. So we'll conclude at 12 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody.